Welcome to Canberra and the second meeting of the Canberra Colour Club, which follows on from our very first successful meeting last month when Dr Loske, one of the co-authors of the fabulous Das Farbenbuch, gave us insights into the production of this 18 colour print masterpiece and the history and applications of 367 pigments and dyestuffs. My backgrounds today are images of the fabulous Ouroboros by Lindy Lee, which was installed at the NGA Sculpture Garden this month. We already have an exciting programme for 2025, which will include a talk in February by Professor Stephen Westland and Maggie Maggio, discussing their book, The Universal Principles of Colour. Followed in April with a presentation by Altonsi Gumbi, a New York-based artist who has recently produced a documentary on colour and culture. Followed in June by Dr Fiona McLaughlin, Professor of Architectural Practice at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and then presentations from CCC members Sonia van der Haar and Laura Berman, with many other topics in the pipeline. But today I'd like to introduce our presenter, for whom I have a great admiration and empathy because of her interest in the mixture of art and science. Dr Alexandra Loske is a British-German art historian, writer, and museum curator. She has a particular interest in the role of women in colour history. Alexandra recently delivered the 2024 Mondrian lecture at the Seekens Prize Award ceremony in Rotterdam, and in 2024 published the book of colour concepts, 2 wonderful volumes with Tashkent. The first standalone study of Mary Gartside, the first known woman in Western culture, to have published an illustrated book on colour and colour theory. She is currently working on a major book from the Royal Pavilion for Yale University. And Alexandra, I'd like you to take over and tell us how your interest in the wonderful world of colour developed. Thank you.
Hello and good morning from England. Good evening, Australia. Thank you so much for this lovely introduction, Nick, and thank you for inviting me in the first place. The last time I was online in Australia was because I got stuck in a pub in England in the snow and had to sleep there. So today I'm going to tell you about colour, of course, and when we were discussing, I hope you can all see my presentation now in full screen. So when I was discussing this with Nick, I thought, well, I can't really give a full lecture on anything because then it'll sit there and nobody else will come to the lectures when I actually give them in person. But it came at a point, this invitation came at a point where I'd probably had my most productive year in colour, and I suggested just looking back on what I've been doing and how I came to do it. And this is by no means career advice because I don't quite know how this happened. And I call it how I fell into colour. And this is a quote from a dear friend of mine, an artist called David Batchelor, who has written beautifully about colour. His best-known book is called Chromophobia, Our Fear of Colour, and he describes falling into colour. So here is how I fell into colour, and really, of course, it needs to be vaguely chronological. And I should also say that 15 years was wrong. It's 15 plus years. This is how time flies. So I'm going through how I came into colour, and I'm giving it a few themes. And we'll start with researching colour, how all this started. And well, it started in this building. This is the building where I work, and this is the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. It was a royal residence. It's about 200 plus years old, and it is full of colour. And I was very lucky to get a PhD grant to write a doctorate to research do doctoral research in this building, and the theme was color, and it was sort of given to me. So I applied for this scholarship and I got it. I think partly because I turned up with a box set of Goethe's color theory in German. The question was, and because this was a funded PhD or DPhil research project, they came to me with a question, this organization, and it was a so-called CDA, a collaborative doctoral award, which means you're not just based at a university, but also at a collection, a museum, or an historic building. And this is my historic building. So this was back in 2008. I started off there. And I'm just going to show you the building as it is now, just in case you had any doubts whether it still existed. So here it is. And last week I was on a scaffold to inspect the incredible, difficult, fragile roofline of this building. And it's on the English coast, looking Indian. And of course, the rain gets in. So that's why I was up there doing a bit of, so drumming up a bit of support, asking for donations. So I'm now the curator there. But this is how I started, and I'm just showing you a few images of this building on the inside. Here I am as a fresh-faced doctoral researcher in my first year. I was completely knackered at the time because I had just had a baby, and I didn't expect to get a doctoral research grant. But it was an overwhelming building, and it's full of color. And the question they asked me was, is there any connection between the surge in color literature, color theory, etc., in the early 19th century and the look of this building? And that's what I spent doing for the next sort of 6 years, because I did it part-time. So you see here on the left the music room, which is full of, it looks crimson, but it's much more complex than that. This is one of the great staterooms, and I'm standing here in the banqueting room. This is the banqueting room. And of course, you will immediately see how intense the colors are. And that was the question, why are they so intense? Which pigments were used? In this case, it's a Prussian blue in 2 shades with silver added to it on the walls, but also on on wooden structural pieces. This is the main sort of spine of the building, the long gallery or Chinese gallery, and you will see the influence of Eastern arts. This was called Chinoiserie as a style, and of course, you know, this came with sort of ideas about color that had nothing to do with the Western world, much more intensity. But that's not the full answer, of course. So here we have a wonderful color called Peach Blossom. And this is, of course, a color name rather than a pigment name. And we have this in the long gallery, not Chinese, but designed by Western decorators, in contrast with this wonderful blue. And upstairs, so this theme continues, the Chinoiserie theme continues. And it follows a particular sequence. And here on the upper floor, the chamber floor, we have not Prussian blue, just a little bit, but a blue verditer, which is closer to the idea of a sky blue. And that makes sense because it was on the upper floor, still is on the upper floor of the pavilion. And this is perhaps the most striking, most important color or pigment in the pavilion. It's chrome yellow. And of course, you are all color buffs and experts. You will know that chrome yellow was one of those early 19th century pigments, I think developed in the late 18th century, but then commercially available from about 1815, 1816. And here we have it in the Royal Pavilion in 1820 in an entire suite of rooms, using it on the wall decorations. We have, of course, reproduced this, but on the right-hand side here, you see a fragment of the original, which has lasted quite well, I should say, 2 shades of chrome yellow. So there was a lot to say about this building. And the beauty of these collaborative doctoral awards is you have free range of the collection you've been given or assigned to, or the historic building you're working in. And this was literally a picture taken in my first week, where there was a really high scaffolding, platform scaffolding in the main dome of the pavilion. And I'm looking here with Gordon Grant, a conservator and artist, at what is behind that sort of Victorian overpaint. And you can just see a little blue fleck coming through. So that's the kind of thing I wasn't working on, but I was able to observe. So I'm not a conservator and I'm not a scientist, but it was really vital to be part of this, to see what's going on. So here we just checked on the earlier Regency decorations from the early 19th century, that sky blue. On the right-hand side, we took away some later decorations in the saloon and discovered a much earlier chinoiserie scheme in a very different color scheme. And I noticed quite early on that, yes, there's lots of chromatic colors in that building in a certain way, and new pigments were being used, but there's also a lot of bling. And this is not surprising because this building was created by and for George IV, better known as the Prince Regent, a man full of ideas about the finer things in life, great collector of art, great patron of the arts, but also liked to indulge, and he liked nothing better than silvering and gilding things. So silver and gold used as colors were used to dramatic effect and as a unifying feature really throughout the building. And the case of silver is particularly interesting. Silver as a color is very rare in interiors, or it's rare that it survives. On the left-hand side here, you see one of my colleagues applying what used to be silver leaf to the saloon in the Royal Pavilion, but of course because it tarnishes, which you can see on the right. And here are the first dragons that I promised you in the title. It tarnishes, so we replaced it in this case in the saloon with platinum leaf. You will get more dragons, I promise. So I spent 6-7 years reading about the pavilion, researching the pavilion, its history, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here because it's a very well documented building and many people have written beautifully about it. But I also, of course, had to read up on the background of color history and color theory. And I'm just showing you a few of my Bibles, my color Bibles. I'm sure you all recognize these authors. I was particularly struck by the one in the middle. This is Werner Spillmann's collection of color books, and I'll come back to why that matters. Sadly, I haven't met him, but I am in touch with him. He's now very elderly, and sadly, I missed John Gage. He died before I started sort of doing color research, but these are still the books that I use every day, almost every day. And I had to combine these two, the history of this extraordinary building and its interiors and color history. And this worked out well. So after 6.5 years and a lot of work, I got my doctorate, as I'm now Dr. Colour or Dr. Royal Pavilion Colour, and you get to wear a silly hat and go to a graduation ceremony. And as nice as these pictures look, of course, some of you who have done research or doctoral research in particular, it's a very lonely thing. You do have to get your head down. You do have to put in the work, and it can be a very, very lonely business. And what I thought, and also it's very sort of, doctoral research is very niche. So you have to really zoom in on your one single subject, and then you also have to know all the background. And what I've found, and you do get a lot of support with this from your organization, in my case the University of Sussex in England, you really have to from early on make contacts and collaborate and support other groups and become part of other groups. And there won't be time for this now, but it is really, really important to network. And that's why I'm here with you, I guess. It's important to look beyond your research remit, your period, your subject. And this leads to being able to write about it. And I know this comes with a bit of delay, but this is the book I've just finished. I'm now editing about the Royal Pavilion. And I managed to get the word colour in. I thought that was really, really important. But all the while all of this was happening, I made sure I made contact with other groups. And here's just one. just one of many. This is the Chromotope project based in Paris. And it's a group of wonderful, wonderful people, including Charlotte Riberol and Michael Winterbottom, who are looking at color a little bit later than my color. So I consider myself an early 19th century sort of color historian. You know, I want to know what happened between the end of, you know, at the end of the 18th and then beginning of the 19th century. But this group looks at what happened in the middle of the 19th century, and they call it the Color Revolution, which they turned into a wonderful exhibition that was recently at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And this is a project that is still going on. It's got an online platform. They've organized several conferences and symposia. And although it wasn't really my period, I was part of this from the beginning. So this has been going on for several years, culminated in this exhibition. And I think it's really, really important because it matters what happened before your area and time of interest, and what happened afterwards. So networking is really crucial, I think, in color work. And we all do that, of course. I could name many other organizations and institutions. For examples, you know, I'm being active in at the Slade School of Art in London, and they have a wonderful little group of pigment historians, and they organize color and poetry events, usually on International Color Day, 21st of March, and these are poets and pigment historians. And I come in, I sort of slot in, I come in from the side, but you know, I love hearing what they have to say about color. And I think that needs to continue, and it's the basis of any work on anything really. So I finished the PhD, and this was about 10 years ago. But I became a curator, and I'm now the curator of the Royal Pavilion, and this happened because of this. So at the end of my research in 2013, I was given the opportunity to stage a very small exhibition called Regency Colour and Beyond at the Royal Pavilion. And that was funded by an EU project, funded from a French organization. And it really gave me a taste of what it's like to be a curator and to convey really complex things to a general audience. And this was partly a color walkthrough, but also included displays. And I worked very closely with the conservation department. I'm just showing you a few of the banners we put up throughout the pavilion. So it was small, but it did make a few little waves locally. And I was quite, chuffed by this. And I had this one case where I could display things so vertically and in a very secure manner. And if you look at that, you see, I got into pigments. I realized there is that connection between the theory and the practice. So I borrowed some pigments from a local artist. And I also borrowed books of the time, of the late 18th and early 19th century for this display, including this one. And I'm sure you all know what it is. This is the wonderful, it's a copy of Moses Harris's Natural System of Colors. This is an official photo shoot. I was shaking holding that because it's one of the rarest and most important books in color history. And I borrowed it from the Color Reference Library at the Royal College of Art in London. It's wonderful handling that, and it really got me very, very interested in print culture and color. I'm a bibliophile, I admit, and I was also back in Germany. I was trained as a bookseller as well, so I always had that interest in books, in particular rare books. But as an art historian and color researcher, of course, my interest was in how were these early books on color colored? How do you do that? How do you illustrate a book on color in color before sort of digital or photographic ways of presenting color? So that was a very small exhibition, but it led to many other things. Of course, I've curated many exhibitions since then, and I've also been part of other bigger exhibitions. And here's one that was really quite an eye-opener. This is Turner et la Couleur, not curated by me. This happened in 2016 in Hôtel de Caumont in Aix-en-Provence in France, and then traveled to Margate in England. And it was curated by Ian Worrell, a Turner and Constable expert, and he invited me to be part of this. And here I am installing one of Turner's lecture slides, really, what I'm giving you now, based obviously on Moses Harris, but also look at the top one. I'm installing, well, I was part of the installation of Turner's watercolor, one of Turner's watercolor palettes, and one of his handmaids of satchels of watercolors. So I also lent some of my own things. That's why I was there, and I contributed to the catalogue. And this really feels, I mean, I really felt this was a privilege to be part of this and to hang these two important paintings. This is Ian Worrell, by the way, the curator, by these late centrifugal paintings by Turner, which of course are a comment on color theory, in particular Goethe's color theory, painted in the early 1840s, shortly after the first English translation of a part of Goethe's Farbenlehre had appeared. So that was a very special moment to be close up to these paintings and to work with them and hang them. Wonderful. Here's an example of a smaller exhibition. This is more of a display, and this is a display about locally at Brighton Museum about Mary, Philadelphia Merrifield. I'm sure some of you have heard of her, who collected color treatises, transcribed them in the mid-19th century, and published them and translated. An extraordinary woman who later on in life turned into a scientist, a specialist in algae. So it was a small display, and I did give half of it over to her work in color. And then anything I do now, any display or exhibition I put together usually has to do with color, because that's why people ask me to do them, basically. Here's one which we put in during lockdown about the early design drawings and the inspirations for the Royal Pavilion. And you can see how this is a family called the Cracers, a firm of decorators, how they lifted colors or color schemes from Chinese art and sort of flattened them and then turned them into interiors in the Royal Pavilion. So color applied is my next section, and here come the dragons that I promised you in the title. So you do wonder, what can you do with a PhD in Regency color and Chinoiserie? And this is one of the greatest projects I ever worked on. It was about dragons. It was about the dragons that were missing from this building. This is the only building that survives at the back end of Kew Gardens in the west of London, which was called in the 18th century the Wilderness. And the Wilderness were lots of little, some of them not so little, so-called Oriental buildings created in the mid 18th century. Of these, there was a House of Confucius, there was a Greek temple, there were other structures. Of this, only this survives because it's so substantial. It's a substantial brick building. The Great Pagoda, designed by William Chambers, who did go to China and published books about China. And you can see how the pagoda looked in 2016, rather dull and no dragons, but there is this image by William Chambers himself, and where you can see little dragons hanging from the hipped roofs of this pagoda. And here's another little example, but they went missing. And they went missing quite early on. They were probably, brought down by the English weather, basically. And the plan was to replace them, to make these, how many? I think 80 dragons in total. And we only have these few images and a few intriguing descriptions of these dragons. And this project was led by historic royal palaces, who look after certain palaces and structures in England. And they were looking for dragon experts, basically. And over 2 years, we had these wonderful meetings of dragon experts. So we sat around the table and shared all our expertise and all of our research and knowledge. And I came in not as a pigment expert, but as someone who knows about Chinoiserie dragons. And of course, we have a lot of these in the Royal Pavilion. So here's one on the right. He hangs in the banqueting room holding the chandelier, and we have fragments like this little claw, which we know was covered in a copper green, a verdigris. But also I did a lot of research on how Chinese export ware was described, and all of us together formed this sort of body of knowledge of what these dragons may have looked like. And this is what happened over the course of 2 years. So we sat down, we compared notes, we had expert carvers, we had pigment experts, pigment makers, we had other color historians, other architectural historians, and we ended up making dragons. And I remember fighting for the verdigris on the dragons. So this must go on. This appears in every description of any sort of Chinoiserie dragon in the West. And you can see the samples of some of the wings there on the table on the left. So eventually, we made a one model, 3D print. I think this one was 3D printed, and it was great fun going on this little sort of vehicle in Kew Gardens and walking around with a massive dragon. But the reason why we did this was because we wanted to know what these colors that we had decided on, that we had researched, would look like from a distance, because this, color has to do with perception, where and when do you see color. So here, 2 of my colleagues are holding the dragon. We're moving ever further away to see at what point which colors disappear. But it was a great project, and eventually we did put the dragons back on the pagoda where they are. So if you come to London, come and have a look at the pagodas. At the pagoda, here is one of those dragons. And maybe you'll spot another dragon expert who was part of this project. There I am with Patrick Beatty, who was, of course, he is one of the greatest sort of pigment historians, certainly when it comes to architectural color in the UK. And he was there on the dragon panel, of course, because of his expertise in pigment history. It was great. I thought, hey, you can actually do something with a PhD in Regency color. And this is just a more recent project. We restored the saloon, the central room in the Royal Pavilion. This was a wonderful project that happened over 15 years. And you remember that first picture where it was on the platform scaffold. That was that ceiling. And here we had to recreate the entire carpet, a wonderful polychrome carpet of which nothing much survives, and we had to bring the colors of the wool down from 24 to 12 because this was woven rather than the original, which was knotted. So that, of course, changes things. It changes whether you have 24 colors or 12, and I was brought in to help with that, and here are those 12 colors and the wonderful reproduction of the original Axminster carpet. Collecting color. This is sort of the interlude, really. So while all this was going on, all my professional work and the research work on the PhD, I started collecting color. I started collecting pigments, not because I'm a painter or pigment historian, but because I felt I needed to know what it feels like, what these colors actually look like. So some of these are vintage. I needed to understand color without becoming a painter or an expert in it, but also how artists used color. So I started collecting early paint boxes, or also 20th century paint boxes, and it really, really helps. And then people started giving me things as well. So I collected pigments and artist materials, started collecting those, but also ephemera in the broader sense, prints that had anything to do with color. And I didn't really mind what age they were. So the oldest one here is the little one in the middle at the bottom, a theory of colors from a small book. And I found it very interesting that there is a female figure recreating Newton's experiment with prisms. And then, of course, the wonderful print of Angelika Kaufmann's personification, allegory of color, which the original hangs in the Royal Academy in London, but also very simple things like color wheels produced in the 20th century, or painting books. And one of the most sought after prints I ever bought, very, very cheaply, is the one on the top left. It's an illustration in an encyclopedia, I haven't found out which one, about coal tar colors. And this is, I'm constantly being asked for this, especially by scientists and scientifics, the researchers, to use it in their presentation. And I started collecting color books, and this is really interesting. As you know, I'm a bibliophile, I love books, but in some cases, I bought these books, largely, most of them illustrated, because it was cheaper to use the images in a book that you own. And I know that a lot of researchers do this because image rights are complex, and sometimes it is cheaper to just buy a book, even if it costs you £50, and then you have the right to the image if it's a certain age. Some were very, very cheap. This has changed now. The color world has changed in the last 15 years. This is such a popular subject now. Some of these books, you know, can't get cheaply anymore. But it's helped me a lot. It's also, you know, and again, you get the feel to how people read and learned about color at any moment in time. Sometimes it leads to other things. So here's a book by George Barnard, a sort of not a terribly interesting Victorian painter in England, but he was also a teacher, and he wrote books about painting in watercolor. I wanted this book because it had this interesting plate of sort of abstract color blots in it. And a few years later, a collector showed me a sketchbook that he had bought at auction, and I said, well, you know, can I have a look at it for a few weeks? And I did, and I identified it as one of Barnard's sketchbooks. So, and eventually he gave it to me. So this is what happens when you become a color geek. People give you things. So it's a rather nice thing. Among the more expensive books I bought was the one on the left, and this is a Moses Harris, but it's not, of course, the ridiculously valuable Natural System of Colors. It's an earlier book he published about insects, which he was an insect specialist, and I knew it included a slightly different color wheel, and it's rather wonderful to have at least one Moses Harris color wheel from the 1780s, and probably almost the most money I ever spent on a book, with help from a dear friend, is the one on the right here. And this is, of course, a copy of Werner's Nomenclature of Color by Patrick Syme. This is the 1821 edition. Really wonderful to have this. Which brings me neatly to writing my own books on color. And I really, really am surprised of how this happened, because I write in English. I live in England. I am not English. It's not my mother tongue, and I never in my wildest dreams expected to be asked to write books in English on this wonderful subject. And I can't go into all of them, and I don't want to really, because it's not an advertising exercise. But I want to tell you how I came to writing these, really. And it began with this, and this is a book on color and poetry, long before I got involved with the Slade School poetry project. I called it Languages of Color, and I edited it. I put a call out. I wanted to hear, after 5-6 years of color research, I wanted to hear about what other people thought about color and how they wrote about color. And I said, I'm going to publish this, self-published. My husband runs a publishing press for poetry. And I said, can I do this little book on color poetry, or color writing, should we say? And this was 2011. I think it came out in 2012. And it was really interesting to hear what other people had to say about color. And I combined it wherever possible with artwork. And I'm just going to give you one example. And I sometimes forget about this work because it has a lot of flaws, but it was the first time I published a book, really. For example, here is a dear friend of mine, Graham Dean. who works in watercolor and makes them look like oil paintings. So I included this painting by him in the book, and I paired it with this wonderful poem by Alison Chisholm called Self-Color, because it's about the color of the human body, but also how she imagines the color running through her body. So nice project. And so I cut my teeth on this. And then I was literally asked to write a book on a slightly different subject for a publisher who was then still based where I live in Lewes, now in London. And and I said, well, can I write a book about color? And I promise you, it will be popular. And they ran with it. They allowed me to do this. And we did it in conjunction with Tate Gallery. So they put their stamp on it. And it's called Color, A Visual History. And it did really well. And I'm surprised they let me do this, because it's a rather it's almost like an anthology of color theory and color in art, with lots of ideas coming together. I still think it works well. And it did get picked up by Smithsonian in the US, but also was also published in French and in German. So I'm still grateful to ILEX, the original publisher, who let me do this. And here is again, it is hard writing a book. It's very pleasurable, but it's also very hard. And a lot of it is lonely work. And it's what a lot of people don't understand really. And why should they? Images are such an important part of writing a coffee table book about color. And you see here the proofreading stage, but also going to the publisher and comparing the image in the book as printed with the original. And this is where the book collecting came in handy. So I had some of these books, and I could literally go with the original to the publisher, and we could do the color check before it went to print. For this book, and I'd like to throw this in because there's no time for this today, but I used to do a lot of teaching on color at the university and in other places. And I always had this problem of explaining to especially young students the different dimensions of color. A color wheel is one thing, but really we need to go into more than 2 dimensions. And I was really intrigued by Runge's idea of a 3-dimensional color globe sphere, his Farbenkugel from 1810, and other theorists had similar ideas really. And in the end, I thought there must be a 3-dimensional model that survives from that time. We know a Munsell 3-dimensional ball survives, and there's others of Ostwald color models survive, but nothing from the early 19th century. So I just asked a friend, an artist, to make me a color globe based on Runge. And I thought, I'll just use this for teaching, and it looks nice. So this was made by Eva Baudinet in France, using a vintage globe, terrestrial globe. But it made it into this first color book. The editors loved it and said, we need to photograph this in the absence of a real Regency, so early 19th century color model. So it made it into that first book, but also into the Taschen book. And then, just as an aside, of course, writing big shiny books is one thing, but of course, if you are a researcher, you also engage in many, many other publications. And I have published an awful lot of more academic texts, including, contributing to symposia publications such as the color studies here, or more obscure things like the book on François de Cuvillier, that was published in Germany. He was a 18th century designer architect, where I managed to fit in something on the use of silver in historic interiors. And then, of course, this edited volume, which is part of the cultural history of color, published by Bloomsbury Academic. And this is, so I wrote the introduction, but also edited the 10 essays by great researchers and specialists in their field. So this is the volume on the 19th century, essentially. Hard work editing. I wouldn't recommend it. And here's another smaller publication on a building that I love very much. This is a lesser known building by Sir Basil Spence at Sussex University, which is all about color, I think. This is 1960s, color and brutalism. And one of my students charted all these colored glass panes from 1966 for me. He got the best grades. And I wrote a little essay on the use of color in brutalist architecture for this. If you want to get into this, once you have your niche sort of field where you know your stuff, people will come and ask you. And here's the Charleston Farmhouse, Charleston Magazine is at the Bloomsbury country seat, where I wrote a little thing about color wheels on a color exhibition. And then more recently for the art newspaper, I was asked to write about my favorite books on color, the 5 must-read books on color. And a lot of things you do for free and others pay you. And I think you need to find a sort of middle way. You need to decide, you know, what am I prepared to do for free, and why could I ask for money? And it really is a combination of that, and you need to decide that for yourself, really. I'm quite proud of this. This is a very nicely produced art magazine here for the county of Sussex, where I live. Review of Sussex Art, Rosa magazine, and I write a color column. So one for each volume. I'm nearly coming to the end, and the next one I'm writing is pink, I think. And that's great fun, but you have to write in a very different way. So editing an academic volume is very different to writing a coffee table book on color, or to write for an arts magazine in a very engaging way. And I think you should, you know, if you want to become a color writer, you really need to try and do it all. And that led to this, and I really don't know how this happened. It's what I call the beast. It's the twin volume of the book of color concepts for the mighty publisher Taschen, and thereby hangs the tale, because Taschen, which is this, you know, empire of wonderful, huge, ambitious books on art and other subjects. And that Benedict Taschen started this in the 1980s as a small comic book shop in Cologne in Germany. And I grew up near Cologne, and I remember going to this little bookshop where you could buy cheap books on art and comics. So I bought the art books, of course. Now, you won't remember that. And in fact, Taschen, when they sought me out, had no idea I had a German background. But it felt really quite special to be invited to the head office in Cologne, now in a huge building, and to be invited or asked to write this book. And I should say it also I wrote about 95% of this, and it was a big thing to take on because it's massive. It's partly massive because it came out in 4 languages, but also because Taschen have their very specific idea of what they want something to look like. And we had several meetings, and they came with a structure, an idea for a structure. And I then was able to say what I thought and what I thought should go in, or what I thought should come out. And it was hard work, but and this sort of started in lockdown when I had lots of other projects on. But the great thing about working with publishers that big and so established is that you can ask for pretty much anything and they will make it happen. So anything I wanted to be included, they tried to get for me. And the most obscure things I asked for were sort of a long sort of colored chart from Australia, I think, where somebody tried to sort of paint a whole symphony in color. And I don't know whether you can see this. Does it move? I hope it moves. So out comes this incredible tome, for which I can't take full credit because it has so much to do with design and what a big publisher can do. It's the other end of the scale to the little poetry anthology I published in 2012, really. I still can't quite believe this happened. But as I said, I was able to actually ask for specific things like getting in the work of Carrie Van Beemer, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, who graces really this sort of frontispiece of chapter 6. And just to go back to the idea of collecting color and basically creating my own color library, this came in handy because some things were so obscure or so difficult to source that we had to photograph my own collection, or some of my own collection. Here I am with Graham Fudger photographing some of the books and plates, color plates in my own collection, including that lovely George Barnard sketchbook, which you see there on the right. And then this happened. And I know when Nick first asked me, he said, can you do something on the artist's palette, your latest book? And I can't really, because there's a lot of copyright implications to what we can show in a lecture that's going to remain online. But I can give you some glimpses. But more importantly, how did this happen? I mean, this is for Thames and Hudson. And when you dream about becoming a writer, you dream of some publishers, and Thames and Hudson was one of those. And I could not believe my luck to be asked by Thames and Hudson to write a book for them on this wonderful subject of really very, very physical color. This is an artist's tool covered in paint. In most cases. And how did this happen? Well, it happened again through networking and friendships and knowing other people in the field. This is the wonderful Julian Bell himself, a great writer on art and color. Julian Bell is the grandson of Vanessa Bell of the Bloomsbury Group lot, and he lives in Lewes, and we know each other. I have interviewed him in the past about how he works, and here is a snapshot of his hands and his pigments and palettes. He recently published this book for Thames and Hudson about Adam Elsheimer, and we talked a lot about how Elsheimer painted light and darkness as well. And I saw him in 2023 at an event, and he just said to me, oh, I was asked to write this book and I can't do it. I don't have time, but I gave your name to my commissioning editor at Thames and Hudson. I thought I'll never hear from them. But within a week, they had contacted me and gave me this wonderful book to write. So I can't really say it's my book because it's entirely the idea of Jane Lang and her colleagues at Thames and Hudson. And first I thought, can I do this? Because I'm such a theorist and I'm into print culture and color history. How can I write about artists' palettes? But then I thought, it's not that far removed, ordering color in your mind and in a diagram and in print to ordering it on a palette and thinking about how to lay out a palette and how to design a painting, really. I thought I can probably do that. But it was a challenge because it had to be written rather quickly. And it was impacted by a cyber attack on the British Library in 2023, which is still going on, really. We're still dealing with that. So this is what we did. And I say we because it was entirely a sort of collaborative effort putting this book together. Sourcing the palettes, finding out where they had survived, getting the photographs, getting the permission, finding artworks that relate to each palette. Which isn't always possible because artists usually either throw them away or clean them up or start afresh. So there isn't one palette for each painting or each work of art, but sometimes there are. And where there weren't, we tried to make connections between the coloring and perhaps the period in which the palette or the artwork was created. So here's Francis Bacon using a dinner plate, for example. As a makeshift palette. And we also dissected the color, so the color content really of each, not of the palette, that's quite difficult to do because a lot of palettes are scraped or wiped, but of the related artwork. And so we broke it down digitally into these sort of color components, which of course was first done by Emily Noyes van der Poel. And this was the first sample entry I wrote on Paula Modersohn-Becker, a great expressionist German artist, whose palette survives. And it's a sad story because the palette survives because Paula Modersohn-Becker died quite suddenly, shortly after giving birth to her first and only child. And I think she would have become one of the most recognizable 20th century artists had she lived longer. She did leave behind a great body of work. And so I had to write these sample entries really quickly. And I did that in Dresden. I was visiting friends in Dresden, and Dresden art galleries do have some work by Modersohn-Becker. But I also picked her as one of the first entries because she wrote beautifully about life and art and painting and color. And it was a way of reconnecting with my own mother tongue, because I could read her letters and diaries in German. So that was a great personal journey for me to start with that. And that's when Thames and Hudson accepted me formally as an author for this book. And just a couple of examples, of course, where palettes don't survive. We searched for images of palettes in paintings, ideally self-portraits, and this is the very first one in the book. Katharina van der Messen, a 16th century painter working in Antwerp, and here she is showing us what she can do with this first, possibly the first self-portrait of a woman as an artist in Western culture. So it tells us a lot about how she worked as an artist, but also what was available at the time in terms of pigments and artist materials. Note how small the palette is and how separated the colors are and how reduced the palette is, of course. But really, I also thought it was important to talk about the theory of palettes and how they are published or printed. And this is where it becomes quite sort of mind-boggling because you're looking at a trompe l'oeil palette here in a book, a guidebook on how to paint in oil colors and how to lay out your palette. But of course, this is done in print culture with lithographs and also hand coloring, but not in oil because that wouldn't work on paper. So that's part of the book as well. And this is where, again, the book collecting came in handy because I bought this book early on and it was then photographed for this work, for the artist palette book. This is one of the last ones I worked on of the palettes. So Winifred Nicholson, great artist who also wrote about color, published 2 short essays, but beautiful essays, and she became very interested in color and light. Actually was throughout her life, but in her last years, in her 80s, somebody gave her 2 little prisms, which you can see here on the right, and she was sitting there when she wasn't very mobile anymore. She was sitting at a desk in her sunroom, still painting and still trying to capture prismatic color, the colors of light with these little prisms. And I think you can see that on her palette. But a really wonderful palette to finish the book or the writing of the book with. But I'd like to finish today by really looking at what I'm currently doing, what I have been doing, and what I will be doing in the future. And this is something that is really closest to my heart, and it came out of my research on the Royal Pavilion. In all my work on the Royal Pavilion and color theory at that time, I thought, where are the women? It's full of men, it's full of great men producing great work, doing great work, but where are the women? So I made it my mission to create a library of women who've worked in color, and this is just a snapshot of what I have collected. Of course, I've mentioned Mary Field before. She's the first one I came across in the Brighton context, of course, a really important figure in 19th century color history. By translating Cino Cennini's book on painting in fresco. But there are many others, and this is the research project that sort of trickles along that I'm constantly working on. I look for them. I look for the women who wrote and published about color in whatever form, on whatever subjects. I make no distinction. I take them all, whatever they did, whether it's a teeny tiny book on teaching color to primary children, or whether it is a great PhD thesis on color and vision, as the one here on the left by Christine Ladd Franklin. I take them all, and I'll try and find out how these women worked, how they published, and what happened to them. And I do have a platform for this. This is my small research post at the University of Sussex, which I retain. And this project is about women in color history. And this was the first one, and it's the first one that we know of who published an illustrated book on color in the Western world. Mary Gartside, teacher of painting in watercolor, a flower painter, a botanist, an incredibly well-read woman. Of course, you know, she couldn't get the same education that men could, certainly didn't go to university, but published this wonderful book on light and shade and on color as a practical handbook for young ladies. But really, it's a color theory in disguise. And this is 1805. This is 5 years before Goethe's Farbenlehre. And look how wonderful she presents her color circle, her color wheel. It's almost a color ball. But look at how she further illustrates the book with these hand-painted color arrangements. They look like, and she calls them blots. And she tries to show artists, young artists, how to arrange a painting, how to arrange the colors. And here are the 8 hand-painted blots, her arrangement of colors, vaguely following Newton's spectrum, with the addition of white in first place, white as a color. Really fascinating. So she's an extraordinary woman, and I've spent, basically I'm going around the world looking for surviving copies of this work. And here, for example, I'm in the British Library in London comparing a first and second edition of the book. The second came out in 1808. And this has led me over the last 15 years to other people, and it's great to see how artists and teachers and other scholars now pick up on Mary Gartside. Here's Breeze Honeycutt in the US, who's a wonderful artist who works in natural dyes. So she works with fabrics and paper, and she has used Gartside as an inspiration for some of her work, and we have done presentations together. So it's wonderful what these things lead to. And it has made a difference. 15 years of working, of shouting about the work over previously overlooked women's work in color has made a difference, from quite silly things, but there are significant, like, you know, Mary Gartside, who did exhibit at the Royal Academy, some flower drawings, now has a set of greeting cards, note cards in the shop. But also more serious things. Here is an interview with Kelly Grovier. Kelly Grovier interviewed me about my work on women in color history between 2 lockdowns, and that will sit on the BBC Culture website indefinitely. So that is a great step. But also going back to this Turner et la Couleur exhibition in France and at Margate, there we displayed Gartside's book next to Goethe's color theory, and that I felt quite sort of proud of that moment, installing both of them together, both first editions at that color exhibition. And this is what has happened recently. This is a copy of the first edition of Mary Gartside's work that recently came up for sale. And when you become an expert in something, you do get asked, you do get alerted to these things, and you usually get asked to give a comment. And so this copy came up, and I inspected it, and I said it's amazing because it has an additional pamphlet or some additional pages, and it is inscribed by Gartside to somebody. So it has a lot of extra bits. And the book dealer who bought it, asked me to write a little book about her. And I thought that is wonderful. I poured all my knowledge that I had at that time about Mary Gartside into this book. And here it is. It's small. It is, you know, the 6.5 kilo Taschen book came out just after this tiny little book. But it means so much to me, and I do think it's important. It's about one copy of Gartside's book, but also about what we know about her at this stage. So it was published by Paul Holberton for Thomas Henage Art Books, and Thomas Henage, the art book dealer, took it to the Winter Show. It's one of the greatest antique fairs in New York earlier this year, and here it is displayed, and it won a prize of the most exciting object at the exhibition. So this is not about my book. This is about Mary Gartside's work and how that is now so popular and acknowledged and recognized. And also this year, fabulous exhibition at Tate Britain called Now You See Us, about women artists in Britain from the 16th to the 20th century. And look at that room there in the big case. There are 2 copies of Mary Gartside's books. So she is now in the canon. This has now happened. And the book on the left was sold, and it is now the most expensive book on color, printed book on color, ever sold in the UK. I'm very, very proud of that. And of course, I offered this talk about Mary Gartside and other pioneering women in color history when I was asked to give the Mondrian lecture on the occasion of the Zickens Prize this year, which went to Pipilotti Rist, the woman who works in color, sort of immersive color. And I was quite nervous about this. I had 20 minutes to get my story about women in color history across, and it was the reaction from the audience was extraordinary. This was in Rotterdam, so just across the channel, and people hadn't heard of some of these women ever. So it has made a difference, and also, not such a small thing, I was asked to write the entry for Mary Gartside for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So she is now in there. And this is what persistent research and work can achieve. And I think it is important. So I hope you enjoyed this story of my color life and how I fell into color. And there are many strands and many people I couldn't acknowledge today because this is not, it's a lot of determination, but it's also a lot of luck, and it's having a lot of supportive people, other researchers and friends and family who help you achieve these things. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm very happy to answer any colorful questions. Thank you.
Hi, Alexandra. Thank you very much for that. It's an absolutely fascinating journey, both historical one and obviously through your personal arc as well. So we've got quite a few questions. I sort of had a few ready here, and then next thing it's starting to pop up all over the place in the chat. So I'll start with the simple factual one. I think you mentioned an Australian colour symphony in the Taschen book at some point in the presentation. Do you happen to know who the artist was? Could you?
Oh my God, this is really embarrassing. I should have prepared it. So the of Demestre.
Yes.
Demestre. And I put him in because there is a whole section on color and music. As I said, Taschen came with they had a concept for this book of color concepts, and then they were seeking out experts to work on this. And I said, okay, yes, but can I put this one in? Right. So Demestre is in because of this focus on color, and but also because there is a connection with Australian artists and one of my color women, and this is Beatrice Irwin. So she did work there. So there's all these sort of overlaps, and Demestre has this scroll painting, and I think it's about 6 meters long or 10 meters long. And I said, oh, can I please have that, or at least a section of it? And Taschen will make it happen. They will make it happen, and it's quite extraordinary. It's each publisher is different, and some academics or some researchers would never work on, on coffee table books or, to order. I sort of fell into this. I was very lucky that I was able to say a lot about that first book, which I think is a bit like a patchwork, but I think it still works quite well. It has flaws, like all things have, but and then once that was out, people came to me, and when you respond to an editor, a commissioning editor, it can lead to really wonderful things and collaborations, but you really have to be prepared to work to order, to research to order, to do new research, and to run with their ideas, because they also know what works. They also, it's different to academic publishing, where you're really sort of zooming in on one thing, but there's always scope, because you work together. You work together.
Well, I hope one that might possibly work would be something on Christine Laird Franklin, because her name really leapt out at me as a logician and a mathematician. And she did some really fantastic work that I was barely aware of. So it was great that she popped up in your presentation.
Yes, the person who knows best about her is Nicholas. What's his name? Anyway, I have great colleagues who know more about her actual work. So what I'm interested in is how did she get to do this? Yeah. Because my research post is at the Center for Life History and Life Writing Research. So I need to focus a bit on how, and this matters with women, what were they able to do? Why weren't they able to do certain things? So why didn't Garzeit have to sell this as a manual on flower painting? Why are so many women in the early 20th century writing primary school textbooks? All that matters to me. And of course, the story of Christine Laird Franklin is, she fulfilled all the requirements for a PhD.
Didn't get it for 40 years.
And didn't get it until, 2 months before her death. I mean, It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. Yeah. So there's a gap of, 45 years or something. And the book comes out in 1829. She dies in 1830. So these are also life stories. Yeah, just as this is a life story. I didn't expect to become a color historian when I left Germany.
Just going to the curator part of your story at the Royal Pavilion, I couldn't help but wonder, what. Obviously, you've got a huge amount of knowledge of color ordering systems and so on from the, as an academic, almost looking down on it, I can almost say organizing it. But in the work as a curator, do you have a preferred color ordering system that you use all the time, or it's too context dependent or material dependent?
I would never say I have a favorite. What is difficult with architecture color, and also Patrick Beatty's work didn't come out until I was at the end. I was in touch with him a lot, because he really analyzes what colors are there, and we have a conservation department. I worked really closely with them, which is why I put these pictures in of my colleagues. So I learned from them. They tell me that's not possible, and this is because, and Patrick's work hadn't been published yet. So I had to, work with Ian Bristow, who did amazing work. That was in the picture there. So it's not about the favorite. I wanted to know, what did the designers and decorators, and perhaps even George IV, actually read about color? What did they refer to? And there are an awful lot of painters and decorators handbooks, Dossie's Handmade to the Arts, which goes through various editions. When it becomes more conceptual and theoretical, then we get into Moses Harris and, of course, eventually Goethe. So I really wanted to know, what did they use? What did they use? And, I found some in the Royal Library, but that doesn't mean George IV read them. I found related things that sort of, or things that are very, very likely to have been read. And then there's also people directly involved with the Royal Pavilion who also wrote about color. So Humphrey Repton is one of them. Humphrey Repton, a landscape designer who he writes a lot about the picturesque and how to arrange a garden and, And then suddenly in one of his books, he inserts a color theory and a wonderful plate, very much in the picturesque manner. What does a landscape look in the morning? What does it look like in the evening? And here's Newton's rainbow. So that's what I was more interested in. What did they read, if any of it? And Garzeit is in the Royal Library, for example, in both editions. And I think she was read by the sisters and the mother. because no man would read Gartside. So that's what I'm more interested in. And specifically, of course, what pigments were available. Were these lists published? This is very early. There's just very early Winsor and Newton, but there's a list called Varley's Colors, which is all about what is actually. It's not just a system; it's also what is available. What can you actually get? Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Oh, no, yeah, it's very complete.
George Field, of course. We didn't manage George. There was no time for. I think I had a little George Field star in there or something. George Field is probably the one who was most likely the one that George IV's decorators were in touch with.
Right.
Certainly used the pigments.
So I guess this is related to one of the other questions here. So I'll just read it out. I don't want to get it wrong. I apologize to the author of the question if I do. It says, during her research, has the author found any remarkable similarities between past diagrams or not popular ideas and later or contemporary color technology which are not directly correlated? So I think the example that he's giving here is Hilma of Klimt, the Swan number 23 painting present in the book of color concept is remarkably similar to HSL color space representation.
Whose color space? Sorry,
HSL. It says HSL. I'm not sure whether it's HSL or lab, but yes, which is in turn related to Munsell, obviously. So in some sense, obviously, over time, you'd expect if you're looking at the same underlying phenomenon, people are going to come up with similar things. But have you found, really surprising connections maybe between older systems and more contemporary ones?
Yes, absolutely. And ideally, I'd like to write a book about this. So, and it might happen. I think there's another book in the pipeline, which I'm currently negotiating with Thames and Hudson, and I hope it's gonna happen. As an art historian, that's my job, to make these connections, but also to make it relatable, and I have wondered, I'm pleasantly surprised, but I have wondered why color diagrams, let's call them color wheels, so color circles, why are they so popular today and still are? I mean, it's now been 15 plus years that I've been working on this, and still the books on color, not just by me, keep coming. The exhibitions on color keep coming. I'm currently preparing one for the Royal Pavilion, which is going to be bigger and better than that first little one for 2020. So why are they so popular? And I think it's because most of them look timeless because they have this abstract quality.
Right.
And abstraction helps with creating concepts in a visual form, and they also look good on social media and in print. So I think that's what really connects them all. It's, you need to reduce something to bring it down to its basics. So Newton had to get it down to one circle sliced into 7 compartments, and then a few sort of numbers and letters. And then when color actually comes in, Moses Harris's book has only 2 color wheels, 2. And they had to be absolutely accurate, but they still retain that. They're completely flat, and they retain that strong visual impact. Gartside goes a little bit off-piste and sort of, paints freehand, but that relates not just to what Turner does 25 years later, dissolving everything, but also what abstract artists do in the 20th century. And I see a lot of similarities there. And I could give you many examples, but one I actually came up with retrospectively, because this artist palette book, as I said, was the idea of the commissioning team at Thames and Hudson, and they just needed the right fit as an author to do that. And they absolutely wanted these color squares in it. I was thinking, okay, let's find the palettes. That was hard enough, finding palettes that you could actually photograph and write about and were allowed, and that had survived, So we have the palette, the physical palette. We have an artwork that relates. If we're lucky, we have images of the studios or the pigments that the artist used. And then they wanted this color breakdown. And I said, it doesn't really work for me. It's a digital thing. You can do it with an app, but the commissioning editor was determined. And then a book goes to readers, to people who vetted whether it could work, and I do that a lot for other books, you know. And one comment was, yes, but what are these all about? You know, how do they fit in? And I then made the connection of Emily Noyes van der Poel, who does exactly that in a teaching context, you know, in this wonderful book, Color Problems, 1901, 1902. And she takes objects and paintings, you know, a rug or, you know, a Chinese vase. And she doesn't even show us the original work, but she shows us the color breakdown in a square of 100 squares. And I think that really beautifully relates. So that's a really good. So there's Van der Poel, and then in 2024, somebody who commissions a book at Thames and Hudson wants to put that in as well. Yeah, but generally speaking, all kind of abstraction, I think, relates to many color. And then of course there are artists who work who use color theory and color concepts as their main you know, subject or motif, such as David Batchelor, such as Olafur Eliasson, to a certain extent Pipilotti. So, you know, there are many people who pick up on that. And of course, Hilma af Klint did it, you know, 100 years ago. Definitely looking at color theories and color and creating her own. She produced some of the most beautiful or aesthetically appealing color diagrams without even wanting to be a color theorist.
Well, I think I'm aware of the time, but this is so fascinating. So maybe one more, and it's a nice open-ended one to end on. If you had to pick a figure from the history of color theory and color that you could speak to for a little while and clarify what it is that they thought they were doing, I mean, obviously all of them, but is there one that comes to mind immediately?
Yes, I think it would definitely have to be Mary Gartside, because there is so little. I'm really clutching at straws. I've been piecing her life together, and it's so hard. It is so hard, and I would like to ask her how she came up with this idea of freely painted this blot idea. Was that her idea? Who came up with this? And what it's extraordinary. It's visionary. It's what Turner does in his paintings, and he gets criticized for it, you know, blurring everything. It's an extraordinary concept because they look like bunches of flowers. These are flower arrangements, and she turns them into these, you know, amorphous shapes, and how she managed to do it. We know she had a female patron, Lady Sophia Gray, so she had support from an aristocratic lady who probably underworked. But it's still, you know, I know what it's like to publish books, and you know, you need support, and you need somebody who believes in it. And yes, I would like to speak to her, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Look, thank you so much. We literally, even if we had enough time, I don't think I could thank you properly. But you can see in the chat so many people.
I'd like to see the chat. I haven't been able to look at it, but
we'll download
me.
and send this to you so that you could see them.
And I'm very easy to find. And watch out, I'm hoping this next book will happen. And there's also the color exhibition coming up at the Royal Pavilion if you're ever over. We're making it very immersive, and of course the book on the Royal Pavilion will come out next year, which has the subtitle "A Regency Palace of Color and Sensation," because I wanted to make it about color, because that was the research, really.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. And over to Nick maybe before we go, but all the best with all your endeavors.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was really superb, as expected. Your work with Mary, those splodges, there was nothing like that around it. It was 1700. It's not current. It was.
Yeah, she was born in the 1700s. The book was published in 1805 with the blots, and then they were explained a bit more in 1808. There are some other blots, so this is why I bought the Barnard, because I'm on the lookout for other blots. And I have a whole talk on blots, dots, and spots in color history. But it's a fascinating. Yeah, she is clearly pioneering.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. It was great, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you all for coming. Can you please save the chat, because I want to read the chat. I haven't had a chance to do that.
Yeah, we will.
I'm going to hang on for a minute. I'm going to hang on for a minute while the others leave. Thank you so much for listening, all of you.